Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining Asian Americans Advancing Justice for this webinar on the citizenship question and next steps. As you know, Asian Americans Advancing Justice is working to ensure a full and accurate count of our communities in the 2020 census. As a national hub, we're working to develop curriculum and materials to support your Get Out the Count work, including fact sheets, toolkits, webinars, social media graphics, translated materials, and more. Our affiliates are based in Atlanta, Chicago, DC, Los Angeles, and San Francisco, and you'll be hearing from all 5 affiliates today. Today, we will dive deeper into the Supreme Court's decision earlier this morning and what this means for our communities. As you know, this webinar is the 10th installment of our monthly census webinar series, which we launched in August 2018. If you missed our previous webinars and want to tune in, you can access them with the links on this slide. They are also available on our census website, www.countusin2020.org, with accompanying summary blogs. During this webinar, we will cover what the decision means, what now, implications on organizing and Get Out the Count. We'll have a Q&A session and then go over resources and contact information. During Q&A, you can use the chat box or the questions box to send your questions, or raise your hand to have your line unmuted so you can ask the question yourself. If you have questions during the presentation, please also use the chat box or questions box to send us your questions. This webinar is recorded, and we will send out the recording and presentation after the webinar. I will turn it over to Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. Niatia, you might be muted.
Hi, this is Niatia Shah. I'm the Assistant Director of Legal Advocacy at Advancing Justice AAJC, and I am here to talk about the opinion. As you know, the decision today was issued by a 5-4 margin and was authored by Justice Roberts, and the most significant outcome was that the Supreme Court found today that Secretary Ross's stated reason for adding the citizenship question that would help with Voting Rights Act enforcement was, quote, seemed to have been contrived and was really more of a distraction, in some that it was pretextual, that it wasn't the real rationale. And in light of that, they remanded back to the district court to enforce that judgment that the district court in New York issued, that the Department of Commerce could only add the citizenship question if it stated the real rationale. So let me step back at this point a little bit and explain a little bit of the process that happened, which was that the Supreme Court heard oral arguments on April 23rd on the Administrative Procedures Act, which governs the practices of an administrative agency, and the enumeration clause of the Constitution. Today's ruling affirmed that the Department of Commerce's decision to add the citizenship question was a violation of the Administrative Procedure Act. And the reason the court found that that it was a violation is because the secretary has to disclose the basis of his action, and that he didn't do so, and that he has to offer a genuine justification for important decisions. So that is the context that we find ourselves in. What this means is that the Department of Commerce at this point cannot print the census questionnaire with the citizenship question on it unless the Department of Commerce offers a real rationale. Advancing Justice AAJC also had a case in the District Court of Maryland where we also had an Administrative Procedure Act claim and an APA, that's the APA, and an enumeration clause claim. We also had a claim that this decision to add the citizenship question violates the Equal Protection Clause of the Fifth Amendment because it was motivated by racial animus. And finally, that this decision was in fact a civil conspiracy. We, like the New York case, won our Administrative Procedure Act claim, and we also won the enumeration clause claim. We lost our equal protection and conspiracy claims, but we appealed those. And so while the APA decision does allow from the Supreme Court the Department of Commerce to potentially, at the citizenship question, our appeal to the Fourth Circuit is ongoing, and so we will not be we will be continuing to pursue that appeal. And if the Department of Commerce wants to add the citizenship question, they will have to not only provide a real reason, but have to defeat our equal protection appeal. And I'll leave it at that and open it up to questions.
We also have time for Q&A at the end. So right now we have one question that we'll go to, and then we will proceed with our presentation. So our one question is from Lauren Whitaker. What are the chances that the question could still show up on the census form, and would this decision delay the start of the census?
So the date of the census is mandated by the Census Act, and it's April 1st of 2020. So in order for that to be delayed, there'd have to be some significant action to be taken. In terms of the citizenship question itself, as we said, the Supreme Court decision right now basically says that the question cannot be added until the Secretary and the Department of Commerce provide the real rationale for wanting to add it. That means that once they do that, that rationale will have to be evaluated. And as I mentioned, in our set of cases that Advancing Justice is pursuing in litigation in the District Court of Maryland, our appeal that the Equal Protection Clause of the Fifth Amendment was violated by the addition of the citizenship question is still pending. And so we are hopeful that as that appeal is resolved, that will be an additional reason for why the citizenship question is not added to the census. But this is very much a moving target, so I unfortunately don't have a yes or no answer for you to that question.
Thanks, Nianti. And we'll have time for more questions at the end of the webinar. So next, I want to kick it over to our affiliates at Asian Americans Advancing Justice Asian Law Caucus and Asian Americans Advancing Justice Chicago for an overview of what now.
Awesome. Thank you, Bessie, and thank you, Nianti. This is Justin Vallis, Policy Director at Asian Americans Advancing Justice Chicago. And if we could jump to the next slide. Thank you. Just building off of what Nianti shared, we know that the intent, like the reason behind this citizenship question, is to try and make immigrant communities afraid to participate. It's about trying to make our communities invisible in the data. This is important because when we disappear from the data, it's a clear effort to cut our communities off from the representation and the resources that we deserve. I had a whole thing about the seems contrived and distraction, but thank you, Nianti, for already getting that part. And it was much more eloquent than what I had. I think the crucial thing for us to know is that the census is way too important for us to play politics with. Not getting an accurate count of our communities is going to have a really serious impact and cause a lot of hurt across the board. Just for starters, 2021 will be redrawing political districts based on census data. That's who represents you on city council, who's at your state legislature, and who represents you at the federal level. It has a lot of impact on voting rights, on civil rights, on making sure that our communities, the political voice of our communities is reflected in government at all levels. It also has an impact on how billions of dollars are distributed each and every year through federal programs. That's hospitals, that's schools, that's road repairs, and that's planning for the future growth of our communities. And we know that's particularly important for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders as as the fastest growing community across the country. And at an even more wonky level, like community groups, like folks that may be participating in the call, regularly use the census data to help support programs. when organizers and organizations know something's going on in the community and they're looking for funding or for reports to put out to help illustrate the issues that we know are happening, a lot of the times people will ask us, well, where are the numbers? Where's the data to help with that? Having bad census data undermines a lot of that ability to show the number behind what our communities are experiencing. And with that, I think I will pass it over to Jonathan over at Asian Law Caucus to take over.
Thanks so much, Justin. This is Jonathan Stein. I am the head of the Voting Rights and Census Program at Asian Americans Advancing Justice Asian Law Caucus in San Francisco. So one thing that we know in working with community organizations and working directly with community members, and something that I'm sure all of you have experienced yourselves, is that in some ways it kind of doesn't matter if the citizenship question ends up on the census or doesn't end up on the census. Trust in the census has already been eroded. Fear of the census has already grown. And so while it's critically important, of course, that we keep fighting the citizenship question, and hopefully the litigators on the team will be successful in their efforts, community members now suspect the census will be used against them and are suspicious of whether they can submit a census response while keeping themselves, their families, and their communities safe. And so it's up to us to give them good information about why census participation is critically important for the reasons that Justin just mentioned, but also protected by law. So let's move to the next slide. And some of you may already know this, but census data are protected by extremely strong data privacy protections. In fact, the strongest data privacy protections anywhere in federal law. Individual census responses cannot be shared outside the Census Bureau. The Census Bureau and its employees cannot share an individual census response with any entity. That means any member of the public, it means any organization, it means immigration authorities, it means a court of law, it means any federal agency. So the Census Bureau by law cannot share an individual census response. It is also the case that by law, census responses can only be used for statistical purposes. They cannot be used to prosecute someone or to pursue someone. They can only be used for the purposes of statistical aggregation and statistical analysis. Go to the next slide. These really strong census data protections are backed up by a really harsh penalty for Census Bureau employees who violate them. If a Census Bureau employee discloses an individual census response to anybody outside of the Census Bureau, including, let's say, immigration authorities or law enforcement, it could come with a penalty of up to 5 years in prison, a $250,000 fine, or both. That is to say, the law takes wrongful disclosure of census responses incredibly seriously. Now, when you share this information with folks, they may not be totally convinced that it means their census participation is safe. We understand that people's fear is not going to be evaporated immediately because you tell them that the federal law protects them from any negative ramifications of census participation. But we do have at least something that we can tell people when they tell you that they're fearful of census. We have incredibly strong data privacy protections in the federal law. Let's go to the next slide. Now, if people are still fearful of census participation after you tell them about the data privacy protections in the federal law, and I'm guessing that a lot of folks absolutely will still be fearful of census participation, you can tell them that, well, first of all, you should probably tell them that participation in the census is required by law, but you can also tell them that the Census Bureau has made clear publicly that if you that you can skip a question on the census form, if you're submitting by paper, online, by phone, or via an enumerator who comes to your door, you should be able to skip a question. And if you skip a question, your form will still be counted. Now, if you skip the census form entirely, you will almost certainly have an enumerator come to your door during the non-response follow-up period. And if you skip lots of questions, you will probably have some form of census follow-up, either an enumerator visit at your home or a phone call from the Census Bureau, or both. But if you skip just one question, you're very unlikely to get an enumerator visit. And we don't know where the line is, but what we can say is the fewer questions you skip, the less likelihood there is of a Census Bureau follow-up at your door or via phone. So if someone is uncomfortable with census, and particularly they're fearful of the citizenship question, let's assume for the time being that it ends up on the census, you can tell them that census participation in full is required by law, but if they want to skip a question, they will be able to do so, and that their form will still be counted. The Census Bureau knows that millions of questions are skipped in every census cycle and are skipped during the American Community Survey that they issue between censuses, in the decade in between censuses, and they don't act on those in any way. They don't act on skipped questions, by prosecuting them or anything like that. The Census Bureau understands that skipped responses are simply part of the data gathering work that they do. So that's the state of play with respect to skipping, which may be, of course, more important depending on the outcome of the citizenship question. Thanks. Next slide.
Thank
I'll
you,
turn it over
Justin.
now to my colleague. Yep, thank you.
Thank you. So now we'll turn it over to our colleagues in Asian Americans Advancing Justice Los Angeles and Asian Americans Advancing Justice Atlanta.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ann Lay. I'm 2020 Census Statewide Network Manager at Asian Americans Advancing Justice in Los Angeles, and I will be coordinating outreach to Asian American and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander communities in California. So the addition of the citizenship question would have absolutely denied us an accurate count. There's data to support this. The Public Policy Institute, there's plenty of data actually to support this, but more recently, the Public Policy Institute of California conducted a poll and found that 64% of Asian Americans in California are concerned that the Census Bureau will not keep their responses confidential. So as Jonathan has already mentioned, we're afraid the damage has already been done and that these concerns about the census will still deter participation within our communities. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done for us to overcome all of the hurdles of concerns around confidentiality, in addition to the lack of awareness of the importance of the census and just general apathy that we know exists in all of our communities. Now that we have a decision on the citizenship question, I'm going to punt this over to Karina Ramachandran at Asian Americans Advancing Justice Atlanta, who will go through what we'll need to do to get us back on track to ensure an accurate count.
Thanks, Anne. Again, my name is Karina Ramachandran, Deputy Director with Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Atlanta. In the South, we know our communities are growing, and they're growing very fast. And those of you on this webinar are probably already familiar with census and understand the importance of our communities being counted. Maybe you even participated in Census Get Out the Count before. But we have to remember that so many of our community members, not only in the South, but nationally as well, are new immigrants and have never experienced census before. So their very first experience with census is cloaked in fear and anxiety, as we've already discussed. So right now is truly an all hands on deck moment to take back the narrative about census and shape community dialogue. And you as leaders on this webinar cannot do that alone. So we're asking that you gather your community leaders, your faith leaders, and folks who are active on social media or at their senior center or language school, and have conversations about census. Listen to their questions and concerns and talk through those. And also provide the facts as you've heard on this webinar. Maybe you have the capacity as a community to form a complete count committee and get out a robust plan for educating and informing the community and assisting them in the process. But maybe you don't. And maybe your participation is about asking community leaders to join you in helping to spread the word about census in a way that really centers our communities, because the conversation about census doesn't do that. We're not talking about the fact that census is for us. It's for our children, it's for our future. But the more that we are talking about census in that way, in a way that empowers us to participate, then the more likely we are to get out the AAPI count in a robust way in 2020. And I'm going to punt back to Anne to give some specific examples of messages you can use.
Thank you, Karina. So yes, obviously message development will be really important to for us to continue emphasizing confidentiality and the strong protections that were already discussed earlier on this webinar. We also need to emphasize that the benefits to participating, so that means federal funding that will benefit the future of our communities through Head Start, Section 8, funding for education, et cetera, that these benefits, in addition to the protections that are in place, will far outweigh the risks. From information that we've gotten from various focus groups and studies, it does appear that people might know about the importance of the census with regards to political representation, but they don't know that that a lot of the funding that we get from the federal government is dependent on an accurate count. And so if we don't participate, then it could mean losses of billions of dollars for our communities. So I think that when we share that information, it does provide a lot of context and uplifts the importance of the census for our communities and for our future. Next slide. So messengers matter here. Anyone can say these things until they're blue in the face, but the message needs to come from a trusted messenger within the community. Otherwise, it really goes nowhere. And we've heard this actually coming from elected officials and from Census Bureau staff. They understand that really it's trusted messengers are not necessarily them, and oftentimes it comes from community leaders, but it's not limited to that. And so when we say community leaders, a lot of times people think about the people that can gather the news to generate press coverage around key events. But really, trusted messengers could be religious figures, or the person running the corner shop where hard to count community members go to talk about neighborhood issues, or even the teenager in an immigrant family who serves as the bridge or navigator for their families. So really, we should think about who those people are in our community, what are the spaces where these community folks gather, and just really think outside the box about who people can turn to for critical information. So next slide. Oh yes, and this is bringing it back to Karina to finish this out.
Thanks, Anne. So we all know on this call, on this webinar, that ethnic media is absolutely critical to our getting out the count effort. Our community is constantly watching the news in language. They're reading the newspaper, they're listening on the radio. This is how they get their information and how they get plugged into civic life here in the US. And some of you may know that the Census Bureau has faced huge cuts to their budget, but you might not know that those cuts are especially hard for their purchased media, and that some of our Asian American communities will have zero ad buys from the Census Bureau. That means that we're relying entirely on earned media, on their reporting about census to get the word out for certain ethnic groups and certain languages. So the onus is really on us to get the word out, and we have to take this moment to really intentionally partner with our ethnic media partners and give them materials to report on, positive material. Invite them to events, invite them to your meetings where you're talking about census and how you're going to get out the count in your community. You can plan, next slide, please. You can also plan ethnic media briefings, are a wonderful way to provide an opportunity for ethnic media to report out and to really see that our communities are invested in census and that we are choosing to participate in census regardless of the rhetoric that we will continue to hear about census that casts a negative light on the survey. It's also really important to watch for misreporting, and you all on this webinar are truly the resource to do so and to really monitor what's being reported in language. It's especially important to correct for that, because once incorrect information is put out there in community, it's very difficult to walk that back. And so we as an affiliation are providing a lot of in-language resources that we will make available on the website countusin2020.org. That includes some talking points that you can use that are translated. There's going to be plenty of fact sheets. But to close this out, we are asking all of you on this webinar to lean in to the Get Out the Count effort and to really own it along with us. It really will take all of us to reclaim the narrative and to center our communities, to center our children and families, and to make sure that we're claiming our power and asserting that we want the representation and resources that our communities need. And it's going to take all of us having that conversation to make sure that it happens. And then we as an affiliation are here to really support you, because those could be really difficult conversations to have in community, because the fear is legitimate, especially given our current climate here in the US. So we're here for you. Our contact information will be listed on this webinar, and we're certainly available to support you in your efforts to raise conversation, have critical dialogue, and to get out the count.
Thank you. We're going to open it up to questions. And as a reminder, you can use the chat box or questions box to send your questions, or raise your hand to have your line unmuted so you can ask your question yourself. And we already have a few in the queue. So we're going to start with two questions. One from Michelle Chang: is it possible for the 2020 census to be delayed by the administration? And then also from Kestine Thiel: what's the name of the case being appealed to the Fourth Circuit? Niyati, do you have these questions?
Yes, so the census date is April 1st under the Census Act, and that's by law, so there has to be a change in law for that date to be moved. And the case in the Fourth Circuit is Lupe v. Ross, Lupe et al. V. Ross, and I think that answers all your questions, but happy to go into more details on anything.
Thank you. A few questions on confidentiality from Stephanie McNally. What is the likelihood that Title 13 is at risk? And also on data protections from Heather Villanueva, could the Trump administration use a policy like the Patriot Act or any other national security policy to bypass sensitive data protections?
I can take that. It's Jonathan, and Niyati can add if she'd like. We've heard of no conversations of any kind that Title 13 is vulnerable or is being eyeballed for, legislative change, despite all of the work that's been going on and all of the controversy around the citizenship question. At no point has Congress even begun to consider the idea of changing Title 13. So any change to Title 13 would also have to go through a Democratic House, which seems very unlikely. So while sometimes our community members are voice fear about the idea that the Trump administration would follow Title 13, they might, in some underhanded way, subvert the law, or there's some possibility of that, I suppose. So there's been, we can't speak to that authoritatively. At the current time, there's been no conversation about changing Title 13. Specifically with respect to national security laws, previous analyses from the previous administrations have shown that even laws like the Patriot Act, which give national security agencies broad authority to act and to access data, their previous analyses have suggested that even the Patriot Act does not preempt the data privacy protections that pertain to census data. Now, there was some dissenting opinion within the national security apparatus about that view, but the majority view was under a previous administration that it could not be used to subvert the data privacy protections that surround census data. Now, there has come to light at least one email in which one Trump administration a lawyer said that might be open for conversation. which then set off a certain amount of concern. But right now, we there's no ongoing conversation that we're aware of that the Patriot Act or anything else could be used or would be used to subvert the data privacy protections that surround census data. And I'll leave it to Neeti if she'd like to add anything.
Yes, absolutely. A few things just to add to this, that yes, there's been absolutely no discussion and it would require a change of law, as Jonathan said. But more importantly, the other thing to know is that even hypothetically, which so far right now, the citizenship question is not on the census. If that question was, that data, if it was compiled and distributed in any sense, would have been subjected to changes so that personally identifying information could not be discovered. That's what the chief scientist of the Census Bureau called adding noise into creating the statistics from the census, right? So even if, arguably they wanted block level data from the citizenship question, if that analysis had been done, right, where in no circumstances would your individual responses be disclosed. But even an analysis of all the questions and the answers together would be subject to this interjection of noise so that none of the privacy would be at all suspect and it would be completely protected. There was no way to, go back and try to figure out how they got to this place. And so the privacy protections are the strongest. And if anybody, even unilaterally, tried to attack those privacy protections, we will be at the courthouse steps filing a lawsuit to stop this immediately.
Thank you, Jonathan and Neeti. And a follow-up question from Christine Thiel. Is there some sort of Title 13 loophole that allows for citizenship data coming from the census to be used by state legislatures for redistricting, since you mentioned that it can only be used for statistical purposes? And do the protections only protect personal information? Is there any information that's shared on general citizenship voting age stats?
Neeti, do you want to take that?
Sure. So I think some of this was I briefly touched on this. So once the census data is collected, they will produce different types of tables and data that is an analysis and statistics of all the information that they've collected, but no individual pieces are provided. When redistricting is done, the census data and the ACS data is used to show who is part of the total voting age population and who's part of the citizen voting age population. But as I mentioned, that information is subject to further privacy protection, so there's no re-engineering to reveal any personal data points. And that is currently how it's going to stand, whether or not there is a citizenship question. So in addition to the confidentiality protections that we have touched upon in this webinar, once that data is analyzed after the census is taken and statistical tables are produced by the Census Bureau, those tables are subject to further scrubbing of data so nobody's personally identifying information can come out.
Thanks, Neeti.
There was also a question about whether the data could be used to create citizen voting age population data. And the answer to that, of course, is yes, but that's because citizen voting age population data is already created through the American Community Survey. So the American Community Survey, as I'm sure many of you know, is issued every year to a small subsection of American households. It has a citizenship question on it. And from that, from the statistical sample that the Census Bureau gets, it's able to draw statistical conclusions about basically every jurisdiction in America. And so when Voting Rights Act cases are litigated, over the course of the decade, citizen voting age population CVAP data is used to fight for majority minority districts or to fight for influence districts or whatever the case may be. And when litigators use citizen voting age population data, they're using ACS data. And so if there ends up being a citizenship question on the census, in all likelihood, then census data could be used to create CVAP data sets, but regardless of whether the citizenship question is or is not on the census, there will still be ways to create citizen voting age population data sets, and those are needed for voting rights enforcement.
Thank you, Jonathan, for clarifying. We have a question from Heather Villanueva. Does the gerrymandering ruling potentially impact the long-term fate of an administration to include a citizenship question if the Supreme Court says it needs a real rationale?
Well, the two issues are, of course, related because the absence of so if the citizenship question ends up on the census, and I'll just reiterate that as of now it's off the census, and we're hoping we'll keep it that way. But if it ends up on the census, you're going to have fewer members of our communities of color, immigrant communities participating in census, almost certainly. There's plenty of data, as Anne said, that suggests that that will be true. That will then make it hard. We will have a harder time showing where our communities live in the process of redistricting. We will have less voting strength because we'll have members of our communities that have been made invisible through the census process will not be counted for the purposes of redistricting. It will also be harder to force majority-minority districts. It will be harder to seek other voting rights gains. But today's Supreme Court decision in Rucho v. Common Cause basically says that the Supreme doesn't touch racial gerrymandering and doesn't touch issues of racial vote dilution. It's all about partisan gerrymandering and the fact that now state legislatures can implement partisan gerrymanders without any fear of reprisal from federal courts. Roberts said in that decision that the courts cannot get involved with and decide partisan gerrymandering cases. One of the difficulties of that, one of the challenges that presents, is that any state legislature that wants to implement a racial gerrymander or wants to use race-based data in order to gerrymander voters they don't like can simply call what they're doing a partisan gerrymander, and they can get away with it. In the North Carolina case that went to the Supreme Court, was decided today, Republican lawmakers were very clear. They wanted to avoid any claim that they were implementing a racial gerrymander with their state map, and so they said, we're not gerrymandering black voters, we're gerrymandering Democrats, and they were open about it. And today the Supreme Court said they can get away with that. And that was one reason why the intersection of racial gerrymandering and partisan gerrymandering is one reason why a number of our organizations signed an amicus brief in the partisan gerrymandering case that was decided today. So these are related issues, but distinct enough that I don't think the Rucho case needs to be necessarily part of the analysis when we're thinking about getting our communities out to participate in census.
Thank you, Jonathan. We have questions on looking forward from the decision today in the citizenship question. So these are questions from Keen Hui Sauer and Brian Mimura. Can you say more about whether or how the Commerce Department could possibly respond with a different, potentially acceptable rationale for the citizenship question that could result in the reversal of today's decision?
We're going to leave it to them to figure this out. We know that one of the reasons that they wanted to add the citizenship question through some of the potentially new damaging information that came out from a deceased Republican strategist was to reduce representation of Latinos and the non-citizens as part of redistricting. So that evidence is potentially going to come into play in the case that is being appealed by Advancing Justice AAJC in the Fourth Circuit. So that kind of is at play here. So whatever new rationale Commerce comes up with is going to have to deal with that scenario. And when they do, we'll be ready to evaluate it for its validity. But in some ways, I think it's going to be interesting to see what they do.
Thank you. We have a question focused on Get Out the Count campaigns from Susie Schultz. What specific impact do you see in Chicago of an undercount, and how likely is there to be an accurate count of Asian Americans in Chicago? Justin?
Hey, I appreciate the direct ask. So I think one of the biggest hurdles is thinking about how we effectively deploy resources and outreach to really get across the sheer breadth and diversity of our communities, recognizing the many languages that we speak, and also our co-location in other communities of color, in other immigrant communities, and across broad geographies. So I think thinking about Chicago and Illinois in particular, there's been a lot of population change. Like we've lost congressional representation over the last few censuses. And I think there's a real concern about sort of like what that impact would be. But in Illinois, we're really fortunate that we worked hard with partners in the state to work with the governor and legislature here to get $29 million allocated towards outreach and education for hard to count communities across Illinois. And so a lot of that funding and the resourcing of organizations to do this work makes us feel a lot more confident that the state is taking this very seriously, the city, the county, and I know all of our organizations and partners take it very seriously. So we will be working our best to make sure that everyone gets counted from Chicago to Cairo. Does that answer the question for you?
Yes, thank you. And another question, are there fines for skipping census questions?
Is there a fine for skipping census questions?
Yes.
Technically speaking, not participating in census, skipping a question on census, or lying on census are all federal crimes that carry the possibility of a small fine, yes. That said, prosecution of that is basically non-existent. The last attempted prosecution of that was from the 1970 census, in which it was an attempt to prosecute somebody who was attempting to organize a massive boycott of the census, and even that was unsuccessful. So while yes, not answering a census question, technically speaking, could come with a small fine, the likelihood of enforcement is incredibly low. And again, millions of questions get skipped on every census and on every American community survey between the censuses, and there's no enforcement action that anyone's ever been aware of.
Thank you, Jonathan. And we have a few questions on resources from Zenny Dong, Natalie Santa Maria, Lauren Whitaker. And so I'll take these questions. So the Asian Americans Advancing Justice Affiliation has a census website at www.countusin2020.org. The recording and PowerPoint for this webinar will be posted, and you can also find the presentations from our previous 9 webinars on that website as well. Today we uploaded new resources on the decision, including a fact sheet and translations of talking points into 15 Asian languages and Spanish. So you can find that all on our website at countusin2020.org. Later this summer, we'll also have 6 additional Get Out the Count focus fact sheets tailored for community-based organizations and community members. With more information, and those will also be translated into different languages. If you want to receive these updates on new resources or any other announcements from us, you can sign up for our census email list. There's a sign up on that website, and we'll also circulate the sign up link after this webinar today. Coming out later in the summer, we have a more comprehensive community engagement and communications toolkit. That toolkit will dive deeper into the key messages that resonate across our communities and messaging guidance as it relates to each racial subgroup as well as different regions. On our website, we also have the recording for our deep dive webinar focused on our messaging research, where you can see more details about that research. There's a question from Heather Villanueva. What is the liability for C3 organizations if they were to advise people not to fill out a question on the census form?
I can answer that. So the 501c3 and 501c4 organizations can have their IRS tax status scrutinized by the IRS if they are responsible for illegal behavior to a significant degree, or for promoting illegal behavior to a significant degree. So if you organize a boycott of the census, which would be organizing essentially illegal behavior in a widespread way, or if you were to tell everyone that they should, if you were on record as telling them you should skip the citizenship question, you would again it would certainly be reasonable to interpret that as being responsible for illegal activity to a substantial degree, and you could line yourself up for IRS scrutiny. That's why we would recommend that organizations do not tell people they should skip the citizenship question, and organizations should not tell people they should skip the census. Now, what the Census Bureau itself has told us is that you can tell people what is technologically possible, which is that you can submit a census form without answering a question. And what you can tell people is that if they do skip a question, their census form will still be counted. So that is to say, there is a distinction between telling people they can skip a question and telling people they should skip a question. The latter could be quite problematic for an organization with 501c3 or 501c4 status. Some organizations are not even comfortable saying you can skip a question, and so they find more subtle ways to communicate, things like saying census participation is required, but a census form, but we recognize that some community members may not be comfortable with all questions. Just do your best. And just do your best implies that you can skip a question if you need to without coming out and saying it. So organizations are finding their own comfort level with this and choosing how best to communicate. We're happy to have a more in-depth conversation with any organization that wants to fine-tune their approach.
Thanks, Jonathan. And we have a few questions for Karina and Anne. Aside from communicating to our members about the news about today's court case and general outreach about encouraging members to participate in the census, what are other steps that organizations on this call should be looking out for? How can we most effectively do our part? And also, how are we getting college campuses engaged? Students, especially in California schools, have huge populations of Asian Americans. So what will student participation look like? And has this idea been in discussion? And this question is from Adam Carbolito.
This is Anne. I can speak to the last question about engaging with college students. So I know that this is something that we're planning on doing in California. There's going to be 50th anniversary celebrations of Asian American Studies program that will be happening regionally in Southern California. And so we are going to use, basically we need to identify and use whatever opportunities we can to engage and train students and work with faculty on ways that we can incorporate students into our engagement and education outreach efforts. So we will be providing trainings for both faculty and for students in the fall so that they can help to identify ways that they can contribute. Oftentimes these are, the more, a lot of really great energy and great materials that these students can help us to produce, and also find creative ways to disseminate this information. As I mentioned during the webinar, a lot of times it will be the students that will be the ones that are the navigators for their and trusted messengers for their families and for their communities, and so engaging with them would be pretty critical.
And I'll also add that we are planning a webinar focused on college students coming up in the next few months, we'll be working with organizations that are activating college student networks and creating tailored and targeted resources for college students to use. And that information will be coming out in the next few weeks. So we look forward to sharing details for that webinar. And the other question was, what other steps should organizations on this call be looking out for, and how can we most effectively do our part, in addition to sharing news about the court case and encouraging people to participate?
This is, oh, sorry, this is Anne again. I just wanted to squeeze in just like one final comment before Karina, you step in, but I do want to highlight that one of the webinars that Bessie had just mentioned about the deep dive into messaging, I would highly encourage folks, in California, we will be producing materials in language using the results that came out from those focus groups as guidance on how to target messaging. And so I would highly recommend for folks who have not viewed it yet to review that and produce your materials accordingly. Sorry, Karina, go ahead.
Oh, it's okay. So in addition to sharing the news from today and encouraging conversation and get out the count, I think there's a couple of things that groups or even individuals need to consider. One is that, you know, we have another 9 months before census hits communities. And so a lot can happen in that time. And in order to, you know, keep communities fully aware of census and interested and willing to participate, we actually have to plan our efforts for that entire time period. And so a lot of the groups that we're working with here in Georgia, as part of our Georgia AAPI Complete Count Committee, are getting together with their community leaders and scheduling events, scheduling outreach, community meetings. They're assigning folks to be the leaders on social media to, you know, continue that conversation over the next 8 or 9 months. And so, and that's work that we're helping to support them in doing, but that they are taking the lead in continuing that conversation. And, you know, the other piece to really consider is that you know, as we get closer to census, we will also be in full-blown presidential campaign mode. And so, you know, that could overshadow the census altogether, or it could exacerbate the fear and the anxiety around the census. And so in order to really combat that, we have to plan for a strategy that's consistent and that's strong. And we need to do it now, so that communities have been hearing from us directly from now, 2019. And so in 2020, when they're hearing a lot of noise from a lot of different sources, they know where they can go for trusted information.
Thank you. We have a few additional questions, but we are short on time. So if you have a question that has not been answered, we will follow up with you directly to make sure you get the information. I want to quickly go over the resources that we have coming out that I had mentioned briefly. So again, you can find our census-focused resources on countusin2020.org. Today, we uploaded a new fact sheet on the decision as well as talking points in 15 Asian languages and Spanish. Please use these, please circulate these, and please share them with your networks. Currently on the website, you can find recordings for our previous 9 webinars, blogs summarizing those webinars, our most recent press releases, including those on our ongoing litigation in Maryland, social media resources, partner resources, and also the latest census news. And then again, coming out this summer, we'll have new Get Out the Count focused fact sheets, including fact sheets in English and translated fact sheets, and we'll have a more comprehensive community engagement and communications toolkit, which includes a deep dive into the messaging and the different messages that will resonate the most with communities across different groups and also within each region. I mentioned we have a few additional webinars coming out. Our next ones will focus on additional discussion on the citizenship question, as well as a webinar focused on Census Bureau outreach and best practices for fielding communications. We also have additional webinars coming out focused on K-12 and teachers, college students, data, a second webinar on messaging, and then also redistricting and reapportionment. Today we were joined by speakers at all 5 Asian Americans Advancing Justice affiliates in DC, San Francisco, Atlanta, Chicago, and Los Angeles. Contact information is included on this slide, and we'll also send out contact information in our follow-up email, as well as a link to sign up for updates directly from our affiliation. Thank you everyone for your work on the census and working to get a full and accurate count of our communities. We appreciate you joining our webinar today, and we look forward to being in touch. Thank you.